If you're a lineman in charge of keeping the lights on, Grainger understands that you go to great lengths and sometimes heights to ensure the power is always flowing, which is why you can count on Grainger for professional-grade products and next-day delivery, so you have everything you need to get the job done. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Logger Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Logger Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Logger Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Thanks for tuning in to another new episode of The Logger Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben DuBose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. I'm joined by my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves, who you can follow on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA. Me, I'm at Ben DuBose. So as we chat this final week of March, let's just be honest. It's an amazing time to be a fan of the Houston Rockets. With 9 straight wins, Rockets are currently on their longest winning streak in more than 5 years. And at 11-1 in March, they had the best record of any NBA team this month. Perhaps most notably, Jalen Green had the best plus-minus of any NBA player this month by a wide margin, averaging around plus 15 per game. So in contrast to some of the other hot streaks he's had over his career, this one is directly correlated with winning. And so because of the team's recent success, Rockets are now 36-35. They're back above 500 for the first time since January 12th, and they're very close to catching the Warriors for a postseason spot in the Western Conference play-in tournament. We're recording this Tuesday night during the Warriors Heat game and also the Lakers-Bucks game, so we don't know if the Rockets will be tied or down a game, but the point is they have everything to play for over these final 11 games of the season. They would lose the tiebreaker to Golden State, but keep in mind they do have a head-to-head meeting still left. It'll be next Thursday, April 4th in Houston. Also, as mentioned, don't forget about the Lakers. While the Warriors are technically the closest team to the Rockets right now, the Lakers are only a game or two ahead of Golden State, and Houston actually would own the tiebreaker against the Lakers. Now, we should note that the schedule is about to get more difficult for the Rockets, and there's a reason Basketball Reference still has Houston's postseason odds below 30%, even when factoring in this recent surge. Tankathon ranks the remaining schedule for the Rockets as the 7th most difficult in the NBA, while the Lakers and Warriors are among the 10 easiest. Now, as we've explained in recent pods, I don't think you should take that as gospel. Predicting schedule strength gets really tricky late in the season because you don't know when teams may rest guys, i.e. the Clippers on the last day of this year. That's when the Rockets draw them in LA, and I would be stunned if they ask much, if anything, of their veterans like Kawhi, PG, and James Harden on the week the playoffs will begin. But even with all those caveats, things are going to get way more difficult than they have been. 5 of the last 7 wins for the Rockets have come against the Spurs, the Jazz, the Trailblazers, and the Wizards twice. All of those are tanking teams at this point. And now if you want to get this win streak to 10 games, which the Rockets, by the way, have not done as a franchise since that epic 65-win year in 2018, well, to get to 10, you've got to win at Oklahoma City on Wednesday night, and the Thunder have the second best record in the West. So I know the Rockets have momentum, and they have won 5 straight on the road, but they're going to be punching in a higher weight class there. Even so, let's table those concerns for just a few minutes and start off by recognizing just how far they've come. This is a group that was 9 under 500 in late February. We talked about the difficult schedule they had out of the All-Star break. 3 against the Suns, 2 against the Thunder, 1 against the Pelicans, 4 on the road. They've had brutal injury news this entire month. Tari Eason, Alperen Şengün, Cam Whitmore, one after the other. Tari out for the year, Alperen Şengün likely is. Even though they made some tactical tweaks at the All-Star break, we've talked in recent pods about the emphasis on playing with even more pace, shooting more threes, getting the math advantage, getting more spacing, which clearly is a priority now in the post-Şengün era. Even with those tactical changes, it would have been so easy for them to sort of succumb to the record or the fact that so many of their rotation players were lost due to injuries. And yet Ime Udoka kept these guys bought in. They kept the process the same. And now as the schedule has evened up a little bit in March and they've played some lighter opponents, they had the tough draw in late February. They've had a bit of an easier run the last couple of weeks. And you bring that same process and now there's better outcomes. And that happens over 82 games. And so kudos to Ime Udoka for keeping them very focused day by day and not getting bogged down by the weight of all those losses, the 9-18 stretch going into the All-Star break. It would have been very easy for those guys to go to Cancun mode a little early, and that simply did not happen. And in this recent stretch, let's be honest, they're not just consistently winning games, they are annihilating these bad teams. And that in and of itself is a win. Look, the Wizards are 3-0 since their last game against the Rockets. The Jazz were much closer to beating several playoff teams. I went and looked it up. They played the Thunder, the Timberwolves, the Mavs in the last couple of weeks. All of those were closer to games than the beatdown they took on Saturday night in Houston. Portland had lost its last 2 games to the Nuggets and Clippers by single digits. Those teams are still playing hard. And so for the Rockets to win those games convincingly, I mean, that says something in and of itself. On last week's pod, we said we'd be okay with the Rockets going 3-1 in the upcoming week. And they went 4-0, and none of those games were even decided by single digits. In fact, in the entire streak, only 2 games have been close. The Kings game in Sacramento, where Şengün got hurt, and winning by 8 against a playoff team. I mean, that's a clear win. And then that somewhat disjointed game in San Antonio right after the Şengün injury, when the Rockets were still trying to figure out what the post-Şengün offense would look like. Every game other than that in this streak, it's been by double digits. And so for a young team to excel at that level, all while dealing with suddenly these higher stakes, the pressure of the play-in race, that's a huge deal. And with Jalen in particular, who's driving this, look, we've said this plenty of times. We were never worried about the highs. He's done that. It's about the consistency, bringing it night after night. And now as the undisputed top guy on the scouting report of every opposing team, now that there's no Şengün. Paulo, I know you want to jump in on that point.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the point you just made about the consistency, and we've seen the highs and lows, right? To me, last game at the time of recording, last game against the Blazers, a game that did not start well for Jalen, a game where perhaps if you looked at the past, he either not finish the game out or just become complacent going forward. This was one of the best defensive games of Jalen Green's career. I mean, you could obviously look at the steals and block numbers, but just he was making positive plays on defense consistently. He was shutting guys down when they were guarding. I'd argue he was one of the top 2 defenders on the team in this game. And then he did what you expect your shooting guard to do, right? The typical shooting guard is no longer that relevant of an archetype in the NBA. You have a few of them. You have Anthony Edwards, you have Devin Booker, who is kind of more of a point guard now. He's more of a combo guard. What you expect out of your typical 2 is for them to play defense, right? To be great defenders, to move off the ball, and to, when necessary, either take over games and break them wide open. And after a really tough first half, you look at Jalen Green's, second quarter and beginning of the third, and he scored 2, 4, 7, 9, 11, 14, 17 points in this stretch, in a 10-minute stretch from the middle of the third quarter to halfway through the fourth. And what you saw was a game that was very touch and go, where the Rockets weren't playing well. Another thing that you can highlight is they were shooting 30% from 3 as a team. It wasn't just Jalen. Jalen had helped keep the team afloat defensively that far, and then carried them offensively and carried them over the hump. Because yes, the Blazers are not a good team, but the Rockets have lost to them in the past, and the Rockets have lost to these teams that aren't clearly more talented than them, but that make the game really tough. The Grizzlies come to mind. I think we lost to the Blazers this year as well.
The Jeremy Grant game where he hit the 3 at the buzzer. Yeah,
exactly. So Jalen made sure, after a fairly poor offensive first half, he made sure that this game wasn't close, and he made it so we didn't have to struggle all the way down the stretch where we know that we aren't the best team in the court. He has been hot from 3 and from basically everything. He's hitting middies as well. for a pretty big stretch during this winning streak. This game was different. You look at the percentages, you look at the box score, it doesn't look pretty. You watch the game and you see, okay, that's star level play. The team needed you and you took it upon yourself and you carried them across the finish line.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's the point I was getting to. I actually felt more fulfilled by the Portland game than I did the Utah game because the 85 points in the first half, 147, where I think Fred and Jalen combined for 75 points, shot nearly 70% from the field. Rockets made 27 threes as a team, better than 50% shooting, 17 of the 27 from Fred and Jalen. Look, every team in the NBA, even the bad ones, have a few games where they just shoot the lights out. It happens over 82. And the Jazz felt somewhat checked out after the Rockets hit them with that early blitz. Don't get me wrong, it was fun to watch in terms of the aesthetics of the game were beautiful to watch if you're a Rockets fan, but there wasn't a lot to take out of it. The vibes were great. They weren't really challenged. And so it was just hoping for Fred and Jalen to set some new career highs, and unfortunately didn't get to. Well, I guess Fred did tie the all-time Rockets record for threes in a game, but it was so lopsided they didn't get to set new career highs because, of course, they didn't play much at all in the fourth quarter, given how insanely lopsided that game was. What I've wondered about through this stretch, they've been so good, but what's going to happen when they get punched in the mouth? And Portland, say what you will, those guys were playing hard. I also think with no Jabari Smith Jr., on top of not having Tari Eason and Cam Whitmore due to the injuries, Rockets not nearly as deep, long, or athletic as they normally are. And some of those Portland guys, even if they're unseasoned, look, they do have the cumulative length and athleticism to cause the Rockets some problems. Felt like there were some tired legs on the Rockets. They've had a lot of games of late, and they've had this playoff pressure. And for a number of reasons, it just felt like the energy wasn't there for the Rockets, didn't have alternative options they could go to, perhaps being shorthanded factored into those tired legs as well, because you had to lean really heavily on the guys you did have. Your perimeter guys, Fred, Jalen, and Dylan, couldn't make a shot to save their lives in the first 30 game minutes. So many things were going wrong. And I found it really telling because so much of this recent stretch, I mean, it's been going so well that we haven't gotten to see what's going to happen when things don't go well, when the vibes aren't great. And for the Rockets, and especially for Jalen, that's always been the big question. And so for me, to see him on a dime, and Ime Udoka noted this post game, to be able to turn it around mid-game on the fly, that's something that he hasn't always been able to do in the past. And that's something that the great scorers have to have, that short memory. And we've seen at times from Jalen this season when a game isn't going his way, he gets a little passive. You can see the body language suffer, and sometimes it takes a toll on his defense as well. In this case, after a bad shooting half, to keep growing, certainly as Ime said, it's a sign of development and growth. And then so many of those points that you talked about, Paulo, came in which he made a defensive play to set up the offense. That big dunk that he had, which gave the Rockets the lead for good, it came after he jumped a passing lane and got a steal. Later in the third, he had a key block, and I think that sequence resulted in a three. So he was turning defense into offense, and it felt like when Chris Paul was in Houston, I used to have this catchphrase that I would bust out on Twitter of Chris Paul has no interest in losing this basketball game. And with Chris, the reason it felt like that, because he was in his 30s, you could see that he's not going to go all out for the entirety of the 30 to 35 minutes that he would play per night. But when the game was really in the balance, you could see Chris Paul kick it into a higher gear when his team really needed it. And I know it's just one game, but it felt like that's what Jalen Green did against the Trailblazers. When that game was there for the taking in the third quarter, when the Rockets fell behind by 9 and the vibes in Toyota Center were not great, people were getting impatient, it felt like he just put his foot down and said, I'm the best player. I'm the most talented guy on this basketball floor. I'm not going to let us lose to this 19 and 52 Trailblazers team or whatever their record is or was. And that's something that we have not seen from Jalen in the past. And I think it's worth calling out because with Jalen, again, it's never been about the highs. We've seen that before. We've seen him deliver against big time opponents. What you want to see from the Rockets and especially from Jalen is, can they win in different ways? Can they win without their best stuff? When the vibes aren't great, when the 3-point shot isn't falling, can they find a way to grind? Can they do the little things? That's something they haven't always done in the past, especially Jalen in this stretch where it feels like he's turning over a new leaf. I think it's it's so fitting that he is the driving force in a game like that, where even down 9 midway through the second half, they still end up winning by 18 and taking care of business. And that's what really stood out to me. And so we can talk about the upcoming games in a few minutes, but I wanted to lead off by talking about what's been going on over the past week, over this 9-game winning streak that's just been incredible, because we need to give credit where credit's due. At this point, the Rockets are basically guaranteed to already be playing meaningful basketball into April. And that in and of itself, it's a massive win for the franchise in the development of these young core prospects, certainly Jalen, but beyond. And that's going to be the case regardless of what the final outcome is with the play-in race. If they get into the postseason, great. If they don't, well, there's things to learn simply from being in these high-stakes, high-pressure games. And so I think a lot of people are going to frame these tougher games coming up as being the true referendum of, oh, is this streak valid, or is it partially because they played some weaker opponents in that span? I don't think that's entirely fair. I think this streak and this 11-1 start to March, best of any NBA team, should show everyone that the Rockets are legitimate. The Rockets go into next season, assuming no catastrophic injuries with the young core for the rest of this season, knock on wood, or anything crazy in the offseason, as I think a bare minimum, a 500 type team going in. And that's before we even talk about getting guys like Tari Eason back and any production from Steven Adams. Ime Udoka had that thirds analogy at the All-Star break in terms of dividing up the season. Are they closer to the 15-12 that started the year through Christmas, or the 9-18 that limped into the All-Star break? At this point, I think it's clear, barring something insane like an 0-11 finish or 1-10, and that's not going to happen, the Rockets are closer to that first third. This is a good team that is already quite relevant in the West, regardless of if they get into the postseason. And when you zoom out, when you take the 30,000-foot view and you look at where we were going into this season, our expectations for this group and their, I guess, upward trajectory into, first you got to crawl before you can walk. You want to get to the play-in range before a couple of years from now. You hope that you're where the Thunder are now in terms of legitimately being a contender. The Rockets are ahead of schedule, and I think this streak proves it regardless of what happens in these games coming up. So that's what I want to focus on first. We'll talk about what's going to happen in a few minutes. But for me, what this recent stretch solidifies is that regardless of how they finish the season, it's not a referendum, or at least it's not the referendum we were talking about. The referendum we were talking about has already been answered. Yes, they are that good. This is a capable basketball team, and let's celebrate that. Now, I guess you can consider what's coming up a new referendum. Are they even a level above what we hoped they would be at in terms of relevance this year, being in the play-in conversation? And perhaps that's what we'll find out starting Wednesday against the Thunder. But for me, I don't want to frame what's coming up as though the Rockets have to validate what they've done the last few weeks. To me, what they've done has already validated what our expectations and our hopes were, even the best case hopes, in my opinion, going into this season. They have already done a lot. So for me, that's what I take out of these last 9 games. And before we look ahead, I want to look back, because to me, these last 9 games are just massive when it comes to everything the Rockets have tried to do and are trying to do with this particular 2023 to 2024 group.
Yeah, man, I think it really helps as like a mood booster, I think, both on the locker room and with the fan base, because we get a glimpse of what this could look like, and we don't even have Şengün, Cam, or
Right.
Tari Eason, right? And I know, plugging those guys back in, besides Tari Eason, who I think is just plug and play on any team in the league, those guys will bring advantages and disadvantages. But I think both of them, both Şengün and Cam, are clear positives in the long run, and right now for Şengün. And if they can build on it and turn it into a play-in game, and I've said this last spot, having a game that big, and if we win 2 games that big, and if we win both of those games, a playoff series this early into these guys' careers is so massive. Talking about, specifically the last few games, I thought something that was really important since Şengün went down was, with the men playing the dunker spot on offense, he was getting, plays weren't designed for him, but he was getting shots, and he was, creating extra possessions by himself. And that's something that I think played a key role in the Blazers game to begin the second quarter. And it had been fading for a little bit. If you look at the offensive rebounding numbers, and I think the eye test backs this as well. There have been a few games since the Kings game where you felt like Amen Thompson was, finding ways to contribute, even though he's not exactly the best half-court player possible right now because he doesn't have a shot because the handle is shaky. And then you look at the Jazz game, he had one offensive rebound, if I'm not mistaken. The Bulls game, I can double check right now, but he had 4 points. He had one offensive rebound. And then you look at Trailblazers game and he had 6. And I think, Amen is a pretty big part of why this is working. And having him come back to finding ways to affect the game when when plays are not designed for him, I think is a big deal. And I think perhaps perhaps it happened because, or perhaps it stopped happening because the games weren't exactly that close. I mean, the Bulls game was a 10 point game heading into the fourth quarter, and the Jazz game was obviously a blowout after the first quarter, and so maybe those plays didn't exactly, the state of the game didn't exactly lead to those plays needing to happen. But I thought it was a pretty big deal that he went back to that. Another trend that I'm keeping tabs on, Jeff Green is on fire on basically every,
He got his
statistic.
second win.
Yeah. And I mean, are we going to have to have the conversation about Alperen Şengün being a system quarterback and what Josh Lando was doing? I'm joking. Nobody clipped that out of context. Okay, people took that way too seriously online as they usually do. But man, it's incredible that he went from a guy that was actually unplayable to
A guy who's actually good.
He kept us in the game during the first half.
Yep.
He was the only guy out there that was efficient. So without him, and he's not, he's not playing the stickman center role where he gets blocks and he gets dunks. No, he has a little bit of a floater game. He has a little bit of a mid range. He can hit some threes. He's showing, and he can run dribble handoffs. He can hit some, some of the backdoor cut passes that Şengün sometimes hits as well. You see the vision of what Stone and the front office saw when they were going to get him, and he's also a pretty huge part of why losing Alperen Şengün hasn't hurt as much as it possibly could. So those are, my favorite trends of players that have been playing well. Obviously, Fred VanVleet has, been reborn efficiency-wise, even though in the Trailblazers game he wasn't.
Notwithstanding. Yeah.
Yeah. So that plays a role as well. But I think those three are really the biggest, the key factors. And I don't know if you have anything else on the past, but if you want to move on to the future.
Yeah, well, I've got a couple of things that I want to note. First off, we may have to start like a Rockets fight club or something, because this recent stretch, so you had Jabari suspended after his scuffle with Chris Dunn, who got a 2-game. You had DeRozan and Dylan Brooks, with Dylan stepping up for what was just an absolute cheap shot that DeRozan took on Jalen Green. Obviously, you had Cam Whitmore and Devin Booker at the start of this streak. You had a couple of months ago, Ime and LeBron back in LA. This is, I think, the vision of what Ime Udoka wants this team to be. And so we can joke about, the fights, and it has been sort of humorous, but the fact that the Rockets don't back down, it sort of ties back in with what I was saying earlier. This team never checked out, and that in and of itself is just such a huge win for Ime Udoka and the staff. Not going to say that everything has been perfect all season long from a coaching perspective, but the collective buy-in, even with all those losses before the All-Star break, it never wavered. And I just think that's probably the highest compliment you can give to a coaching staff, especially with a coaching staff that has so many young guys, because these are the exact type of guys that we've seen the last couple of years check out a little bit early, the bad habits under Stephen Silas. We have not seen any of that this year. So don't know if we necessarily need a fight club, but I do think on some level it speaks to the culture that Ime has put in place. And then a more serious observation that I wanted to get your take on. So there's been a lot written in NBA media the last few weeks about how officiating has changed since about the end of January. And we've seen scores plummet around the league. And the idea is that the NBA wants its officials to call games a little looser because the rules have been tilted towards the offense for so long that the scoring was just getting out of hand. It was impossible to play defense. There were a lot of complaints about the game becoming just less aesthetically pleasing to watch because it's so hard to defend at a high level. And so scoring has definitely dipped over the last 6 weeks or so. I'm wondering if that plays some role in this resurgence we've seen from the Rockets defense. Now, some of it, they got healthier over the All-Star break. They got their second win. A lot of these veterans that we talked about earlier, for example, with Jeff Green, and certainly I think it applies to Dylan and Fred as well. We talked about that in recent pods. But I also can't help but wonder, look, this stretch out of the All-Star break when it seemed like the Rockets got their second win, and that's probably some of it, but it also comes at a time in which the NBA is letting defenses play a bit more physical. And for a team like the Rockets, especially in the post-Şengün era, where they are a little lighter, they are a bit undersized. Other than the Landale minutes, they don't really have a traditional center. And even Landale, while he's tall enough to be a traditional center, it's not like he's super athletic. When you have a team that's like what the Rockets are at the moment, the way to overcome some of those physical limitations is to be, rough around the edges, to bump and grab and try and set a tone with your physicality. And I'm sure some will listen to this and say, well, are you saying that they're fouling? Yeah, but what I'm saying is that if that's going on more around the league, if defenders everywhere are getting a bit more leeway, does it not stand to reason that the Rockets, as a team that's a little on the small side, doesn't have a traditional center, and wants to play very physically anyway under Ime Udoka? Fred VanVleet's a small point guard, but he does play very physically. He's got great hands. Does it not stand to reason that this officiating emphasis could benefit a team like Houston disproportionately? Because it sort of feels like that the Rockets' resurgence on defense, which really started around, early to mid-February, is timed pretty conveniently with this change in the officiating emphasis. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so I've definitely noticed around the NBA and in other games that the refs are calling less fouls, less free throws. I'm not too sure how that impacts our games because I was trying to recall this and then I went and checked. We are still getting and giving up. I mean, exception to the Portland game in which we gave up 15 and the Cleveland game in which we gave up, something close to it. We're still giving up and getting 20 to 25 to sometimes, the Jazz game, they got 33 free throws a game. So, but I do at the same time agree.
Although keep in mind that the pace is up a tick, especially with the starters.
For sure. But I do agree that they're allowing more physicality, and I do agree that helps us. And isn't it interesting that while they are allowing more physicality, Jalen Green is somehow finishing better at the rim, but that doesn't make any sense because he's supposed to be afraid of physicality, and I think he is. I think that was a very valid observation. But then how do you correlate that with, he's doing better at the rim, but guys are allowed to, bump you more? It's an interesting trend, but as a concept, I do agree that a team that already played the physicality, having less fouls being called, and definitely helps.
Yeah, and with Jabari at the 5 and switching everything, then we know in a switch-heavy scheme, you're going to try and get certain advantages with holding when you can, and that just sort of accompanies that playing style. And so I think it was going to benefit a team like the Rockets anyway. And now with Şengün out and going to just all out switching, well, I shouldn't say all out because it's not like they do it every single time, but even more aggressively than they were before, then yeah, I think that sort of plays a role in the Rockets' resurgence. Not trying to take anything away from those guys because they are playing better, they are playing harder than they were going into the All-Star break, but I do think that this disproportionately helps them. And to your point on Jalen, yeah, I mean, he's doing all of this even with a whistle that in theory should work against him. He's finishing at the rim better and he's getting more free throws, even in a time on the NBA calendar where these are getting called less and less. So if anything, the current dynamics, the current stats might be underselling Jalen a little bit in terms of the true extent of how his game has changed over the last few weeks. By the way, one thing, and we don't have to get into this today, we can save this for, I think, an off-season pod when we look at the post-Şengün era of the Rockets, both the advantages and the disadvantages. I think people are underselling the change in pace. I've seen a lot made of, well, the pace isn't really that different. Well, no, what's happened is that the bench units are a touch slower because now you're having to play with a man in the starting lineup and Reggie Bullock now back into the
Oh, that's
rotation off the
really
bench.
interesting.
Yeah, like the Rockets are playing at a similar pace overall, but I do think by the eye test, they're playing at a faster pace offensively with a men in place of Şengün. What's happened is that the bench units, which were uber fast for most of this season, especially with Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore, now you don't have either of those two with Amen in the starting lineup and Cam hurt. And so the starting lineup is up a little bit, the bench is down a little bit, and so you end up with the net pace, the net possessions per game being about the same. However, I feel pretty confident that if you dig deeper and you look just at the starting lineup, then this post-Şengün era with Jabari at the 5 and then at a forward spot is playing a little bit faster, and perhaps that plays a role in Jalen's success. Don't want to get into that too much yet because it's still early, and again, we can evaluate that at the end of the season when we have a larger sample. That will be a better time for macro discussions, I think. This pod, want to keep it micro because Rockets are in a postseason push at this point. They very much have a path to the play-in tournament in the West. And so with that, let's transition to the games ahead. Because as easy as the last few games have been, mentioned that 5 of their last 7 wins have come against teams that are clearly tanking. When you look at this next week, they've got Oklahoma City Wednesday night. You have Utah on Friday. That's the one easy game, but easy in quotes because it's never easy to win at Salt Lake City. Then you've got Dallas at home on Sunday and Minnesota on the road Tuesday. So 3 of the 4 on the road. Your one home is against Dallas, a very good team. So I want to spotlight these 4 because what's after those 4 games is that big game at home on April 4th against the Golden State Warriors. And I feel like everyone has that circled on their calendars for the obvious reason. We want that to be like a de facto playoff game at Toyota Center. If the Rockets could beat the Warriors with Steph Curry and Draymond Green with those kinds of stakes for this fan base in particular, it would feel so fulfilling. But for that game to be as meaningful as we want it to be, the Rockets, in my opinion, can't go, certainly not 0-4, but I wouldn't even say 1-3 over the next week. They need to stay at least at 500 because, let's be honest, as of our recording time at least, the Rockets need to make up multiple games against either the Lakers or the Warriors. As things stand, because the Rockets lose the tiebreaker to Golden State, it's not just the one game that they trail in the loss column. You would also need to clear the Warriors. So when you're having to make up multiple games over the final 11, your margin for error, while not nothing, it's also not great. So I think you want to be 500 at a minimum. Now, we should note that the schedule for the Warriors is not easy. They've had a back-to-back in Florida, Heat tonight, Magic tomorrow. That's losable. Let's see, who do they have after that? At Charlotte, that's probably a layup. At San Antonio, could be a layup, but the Spurs have been feistier of late. Then they've got the Mavs, and then that huge Rockets game on the 4th. So I think it's reasonable to find a couple of losses for the Warriors in there. I don't think it's reasonable to expect them to go 1-4, 0-5, something crazy like that. Keep in mind, the other night, while they lost to the Timberwolves, they were on the road against the top team in the West, and they were right in it until the final seconds. It's not like the Warriors are playing bad ball. The Lakers, let's see. I mean, they play at Milwaukee tonight, at Memphis, at Indiana. Those aren't gimme games. The one at Indiana is particularly losable. So again, you can look at their schedule coming up, then games at Brooklyn, at Toronto. Those are probably layups. Although Brooklyn did win the other night, although that puts Rockets fans in sort of a conundrum of, yeah, you want to cheer for Brooklyn, but it does potentially hurt your draft stock a little bit in terms of that Brooklyn lottery pick that you're going to own this year. The point is, for me, looking at the Lakers and Warriors, I think it's reasonable to expect a couple losses in there. I don't think it's reasonable to expect either to fall off the map in the next week. So because of that, as the schedule stiffens, the Rockets can't fall off the map themselves. I don't think they have to, stay on the winning streak. They do have some buffer in regards to, a 2-2 week would not be fatal by any stretch. And then, you look at the final week of the season, I think that final road trip against the Jazz and the Blazers, who are both likely to be in full-on tank mode by that point, and then the finale against the Clippers, who are likely to be sitting everyone. Rockets can make up games down the stretch of the season. They also have a stretch from April 4th through the 9th with 3 or 4 at home, where they've been so great all year. So the Rockets do have some upward mobility later on. They just need to hang on over the next week and get to that April 4th game at Tuner Center, which kicks off that home stretch. And of course, with a matchup against the Warriors is going to mean so much with regards to the play-in odds. So for me, as I look at this week, the cleanest route to 2-2, that game at Utah, I know it's never easy to win on the road, but find a way. You're the better team. We know what the Rockets did against the Jazz in Houston last weekend. And then one of the other three. I feel like Thunder on the road, Mavs at home, at Minnesota, one of those 3 games, the 3-point variance should go your way, and just find a way to grind it out. And if you get to 2-2, I think the schedules for the Warriors and Lakers, while not murderer's row by any stretch, they're challenging enough to where you can at least maintain the status quo entering, I would say, the closing kick, which starts April 4th against the Warriors. And that's sort of my goal. Like, if the Rockets make up more ground over the next week, I would be thrilled, but I'm not expecting it. My hope over the next week is sort of just stay where you are now within a game or two. And then the final 10 days of the season, that closing stretch starting April 4th against the Warriors with that head-to-head opportunity. Unfortunately, the Rockets do not have a game left against the Lakers. They have the tiebreaker, but no direct games in which they can make up a game simply by beating the team they're chasing. That's the one advantage of the Warriors. Lakers' advantage is the tiebreaker. But yeah, for me, it's just find a way to tread water over the next week. And then that closing stretch starting the 4th, I think that's where the Rockets really have their best potential path to getting a play-in spot over the Warriors or the Lakers. That's sort of how I'm looking at this schedule holistically. Paulo, what are your thoughts as far as the schedules and how they shake out for the Rockets and these other teams?
Yeah, I think you made a ton of really good points. I'll add a couple of things that have sprung to mind. The Thunder game is actually the second half of a back-to-back.
Yep.
For them.
So, and they're in New Orleans tonight, so they have travel in between. Yep.
And New Orleans is a really physical team. They're going to wear you down. Valanciunas is a really physical player. Alvarado is going to force you to run. What's the guy? Valanciunas is obviously. Did I mention him or Zion before? I meant both of them. You know what I meant. And they are coming off of a loss the last game, so they might go all in to win this game, and they may or may not rest some guys in the second half of a back-to-back.
And that's one of those things where the strength of schedule metrics, it goes back to what we said earlier, are not predictive, because even though a team like New Orleans or a team like Oklahoma City, I went and looked, they typically have not rested guys on back-to-backs this season. At the same time, that calculus might shift now that you're in the final 2 weeks of the season, actually getting close to play-in time. That's when some of these teams do get more conservative. And so that's why, again, you have to take these strength of schedule metrics with a grain of salt, because some of these really good teams are going to be a bit more conservative this time of year.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention that I'm actually been really not impressed with the Warriors just watching them play. I mean, I'm going to be fair. I'm going to be honest with you.
I generally agree with you. I just think the game against Minnesota was a little more encouraging, but longer term, yes.
The thing is, the game against Minnesota, Anthony Edwards was not having a game up to his potential there. They don't have Karl-Anthony Towns. And so when you look at that team, defensively, they're good. But then offensively, you're looking at, Ant. And then you have Gobert, who's not an offensive player. McDaniels is okay off ball. Mike, 36-year-old Mike Conley, there's not that much there. And then that game, Klay Thompson was playing pretty well as well, and they don't get that a lot. Although Kuminga was struggling, but they don't get that a lot. And so I'm just confused. They don't seem to be going full throttle for the play. And how is Steph Curry playing 29 minutes a game unless he's actually hurt? Over the last, 10 games, he's playing 29 minutes a game. How is the team that's making a push for the play-in just letting that happen? The other thing I'll mention, you touched on the Lakers playing the Nets and perhaps rooting for the Nets, even though the pick. Listen, just an update on the pick, right? It's done. It's not going up or down. The Nets have 4 more wins than the Raptors have. The Raptors have gone full-blown tank now that Scotty Barnes is hurt. And the Hawks are 4.5 games clear. So it's 5.5 games. It's even better than I expected. The Nets, I'm just not gonna watch Nets games anymore. I mean, they're bad enough as it is. It's not a pleasing game to watch.
Right.
But yeah, just root for the Nets to win against the Lakers because there's just no chance that it goes up or down unless I miss someone in the Western Conference. I guess there's the Jazz who could surpass them, or that they could surpass, but for the most part, I think it's not that big of a difference. And then as far as our games are concerned, I think the Jazz game, if you have playing hopes, the Jazz game has to be a layup. They've been giving up enormous amounts of points, basically every team in the league, even though fouls are getting called less and less. And then the Mavs are a really interesting case because they're an awful defensive team, which usually bodes well for the Rockets because the easier you make the offense, the better for us because we got the defense taken care of. But then you're in a shootout against a team that has Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic, which is not that great. And the other thing that worries me is now that we're playing small ball, even though Şengün had problems with this as well, the Jazz run a pick and roll offense for the most part. Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively are, they're Clint Capella's, and they get a ton of lobs. And so I'm scared about how they may punish us in the pick and roll game with the lobs. I think Gafford's coming off of a 24-point game against the Jazz where he just dunked like 7 or 8 times. So that's what I'm looking, towards. And then we will catch a Timberwolves team that is somewhat weakened by not having, Karl Anthony Towns. And you're really just coin flipping with them. Is Anthony Edwards going to have a game where he just crushes you the entire game, or are you going to be able to keep him in check and then you have a real shot at winning?
Yeah, and I guess the glass half full way of contextualizing that Warriors Timberwolves game from Sunday is that, well, maybe if you buy in, and I think your points are valid, that some of it was just the Timberwolves having a tough night with Ant not being on and Towns not being available, then if some of it's the Timberwolves not playing well themselves, or a lot of it, then shouldn't the Rockets have the same benefit potentially when they visit Minnesota next week? Time will tell. Obviously, we'll see how Anthony Edwards plays in that game, but at least there's a roadmap to it. So I think that's at least a glass half full way that you can frame this. And then as far as keys, I think this is not going to surprise anybody because I've made this point in recent pods, but the return of Jabari Smith Jr., I know he missed just one game due to the suspension for the fighting with Chris Dunn, but it really felt like in the first 2.5 quarters of that Portland game, the Rockets really missed Jabari because on a game in which none of the perimeter guys were making shots, Fred, Jalen, and Dylan in particular, it felt like with that starting unit, there wasn't really an alternative for them to turn to. I mean, they had to be rescued by Jock Landale, of all people, as you said. With Jabari, it's not that you want to rely on him heavily offensively. I don't think he's there yet in year 2, but he's at least an option, a guy who, if you're not shooting well from 3, can hit a couple of mid-range shots and buy you time. Against the schedule coming up, I don't think the Rockets can win most of these games, the Jazz being probably the exception, if they're not shooting well from 3. But where I think Jabari is useful is in sort of keeping you in striking distance and buying time until the threes eventually fall. Because even against the Trailblazers, I mean, the Rockets could have fallen behind by a much more problematic amount than 9 if not for Landale rescuing them in the first quarter of that game. And I don't think that's something you want to depend on every single game, even though Landale has played much better of late. So Jabari is someone that this month, we've talked about it, has sort of perked back up from 3-point range. He's at 37% on threes in March, which is really encouraging after he dipped to just above 30% in February. So the 3-point shot is getting better. His overall field goal percentage, it dipped to 38.6 in February. It's back up to 45, nearly 46 in March. So for me, Jabari as a release valve and someone that can just buy them time, not saying it needs to be super high usage or anything crazy, but I just think that game last night showed you the limitations of the post-Şengün model and that, yeah, they're going to put up a lot of threes, and most nights they have the shooters to make that work. But in a game where it gets sticky or they get into foul trouble, then there's not a clear secondary option. And Jabari is probably the best they've got, especially with Cam Whitmore still sidelined by the knee injury. Sounds like he's getting closer, but he's still ruled out for Wednesday at Oklahoma City. So his return not imminent. So with that in mind, I worry a little bit about what do you do offensively if it's a night where you're not making threes and maybe Jalen's a little bit cold and needs time to find his rhythm. Jabari as the release valve, I think, is the best option they've got. So for me, that's sort of the key that I'm highlighting. Paulo, from a player or a tactical standpoint, anything that you're looking at over these next few games as far as something that's going to be a key variable for the Rockets?
Yeah, to me, it boils down to Jalen. I think
Fair. That's
you
the
know,
low-hanging fruit, but true.
yeah, it's. I mean, but it's the truth, right? We need Jalen
Yeah.
to win games. I think he is by far the most important player on the team. He has been, and he will continue to be, because without Alperen Şengün, there's nobody on this team that can create advantages by himself. Even Jalen is not as reliable as Şengün was, but Fred VanVleet's not at that point in his career, and Jabari Smith may get there. There's games where maybe there's a game where he's hot. It's tough. Dylan Brooks can get there by making really tough shots, but he's not really an advantage creator. So Amen Thompson's obviously not hasn't got the handle at this point to do it. So
off-ball guy.
Yeah, it's just I think it just exacerbates how important Jalen's going to be to this going forward. And I know we want to touch on this. I don't know if I have anything else about the next few games, but it's a perfect transition to
one random thing. I was looking up Jabari splits when I was mentioning his uptick in March. For some reason, in games played on Wednesday, the Rockets have had 15 of those, most of any day of the week. Jabari is shooting 41% from three. Have no idea why that is. Obviously, it's totally random, but Wednesday at Oklahoma City would be a hell of a time for Jabari to have another one of those Wednesday games where he goes off and gives the Rockets more of a relief valve. Anyway,
how do you even notice that?
Well, ESPN has some crazy splits. I was looking up, like I said, to look at the gap from February to March and the improvement. And then they also have splits by day of the week. And I was like, holy shit, Jabari actually does play really well on Wednesdays. Of course, that's totally random, but whatever, we'll take it. And he typically has played well against Oklahoma City as well. I remember he had a couple of good games late in February when the Rockets had 2 losses, although those games were competitive. Now, we should note, by the way, after the Portland game, Jalen was asked about those, and Jalen said the Rockets are playing a very different style of basketball right now. And so I thought that was telling. We don't need to get into that today because we've gone on long enough already, but I do think that sort of hints at some of the underlying dynamics that we were referencing earlier in terms of the way this team has shifted since losing Şengün, and perhaps that's to the betterment of Jalen Green. We'll have to see how the season finishes, and then we can pick up that conversation in the offseason when it's more of a time to look at macro-level Rockets and what we learned from this season. Anyway, finishing up this pod, let's go back to Jalen, because he is the central piece for everything going on with the Houston Rockets right now. And yet, even with all the positives, there was a storyline that, at least from a Rockets perspective, was not entirely positive this week. That's Shams Charania giving a megaphone to the report that previously was just out of Brooklyn, alleging that Jalen Green was a part of the trade talks for Mikal Bridges before the trade deadline. Nets, of course, for whatever reason, are acting like Mikal is a superstar and untouchable. They want to build around him, yada, yada. Weird situation. Reports out of Brooklyn indicating the Rockets included Jalen with those Brooklyn picks, which, as we've referenced so many times in the past, should be disproportionately valuable to the Nets. That's why the Rockets reached out to them, wanting to see if there was a fit in regards to a deal involving Bridges or anything else. Bridges being the best player, obviously that makes the most sense, and the Nets shut it down. The Rockets' perspective, as we've said on the pod before, is that it never got to the point of identifying names or anything super concrete with the talks. It was a very abstract question of, do you want to explore something involving Mikal Bridges, who the Rockets do like? Say what you will about Mikal right now, he's sort of miscast in this star role, or the closest thing the Nets have to that. If you put him in something more analogous to the role he had in Phoenix when he was playing alongside Devin Booker and Chris Paul, he's a very good player on a great contract. And so I can see why the Rockets have some intrigue. And the Rockets' position, as has been articulated to me, I've said it on the pod in the past, and to some of the national guys, Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype has reported the same thing, is that talks never got to the stage of exchanging names. The Nets just simply made it clear that Bridges was not going to be moved, and that's that. to this point, they don't seem to want to bottom out, even though they're sort of doing that anyway, as Paulo referenced earlier. But this report from Shams, which I strongly suspect is sourced from the Brooklyn side of things, is indicating that Jalen Green was potentially a part of those conversations in late January or early February before the deadline, which I believe was on the 8th. And so even with Jalen and the Rockets playing so well, that's led to some on Twitter wondering about the long-term fit. Do the Rockets really believe in Jalen? It's led others to wonder about the front office. Does Rafael Stone know what he's doing? We've had those conversations ad nauseum the last couple of years. It's exhausting, but somehow a lot of people have to find new angles to it. And it feels like even the stretch where so many things are going great for Jalen and the Rockets on the basketball floor, at least on social media, Shams, giving a bit more credence to the idea that maybe Jalen was in those talks, reignited some of that this week. For me, however, I'm exhausted by the storyline, and I think it's largely pointless. And I want to explain it from a couple of different perspectives. First, it doesn't matter whether Jalen was or wasn't in the talks in late January or early February. The Rockets have new information now. And so when it comes to the matter of Jalen's future with the team, what's going to happen this offseason? Does he get a contract extension? How committed are the Rockets to him in the longer-term blueprint? The Rockets this offseason are not going to be only focusing on things from the first 2.5 years of his career. They are also going to include what's happened over the last few weeks. And as mentioned leading off the pod, it's been strongly correlated with winning. So I don't see the need to obsess over what may or may not have happened a few weeks ago. Look, we've learned new things. Jalen Green is playing at an incredibly high level now. Be thankful for that. And yes, the Rockets notice that as much as anyone, and they will factor that in to their analysis this offseason of his long-term value to the team and where he fits in. So to some extent, it doesn't even matter because the Rockets are learning new things just as we are. And while I think everyone around the Rockets, certainly me and you, Paulo, we were pretty down on Jalen as recently as the All-Star break just a little over a month ago, our view on him has evolved. And I think that's the case too with the Rockets coaches and front office. These guys, these young prospects, they're still developing, and there may be rapid swings for better or for worse. This is a rapid swing in a good direction. And so when it comes time to think bigger picture of the offseason and think strategically about what the fit's going to be, the Rockets are going to have new information that they did not have in January or February. So I think on some level, it doesn't matter. I also think beyond that angle, some will say, well, should Rafael Stone have known? Does this prove that he's incompetent? Folks, Rafael Stone is not the only GM in the NBA that had a negative impression of Jalen Green. There were lots of reports in December and January about Jalen's potential trade value that were sourced from talking to people around the NBA. It was not great. People around the league noticed what was going on in Houston, the problems, the same way that we did. So no, this is not just a Rafael Stone problem. People around the league were bearish on Green's value based on his production before the trade deadline and really all the way until the All-Star break. Now, I think that's changing in a big way now. Credit Jalen. I didn't think he could turn it this fast. He's proved me wrong. He's been spectacular. But if your view is that, well, the Rockets should have seen this coming, and if they didn't, then this just proves they're incompetent. Well, number one, it's not just the Rockets. A lot of people were down on Jalen Green's value. Your head has been in the sand if you have not seen that. And beyond that, even within the Rockets, Rafael Stone is not the only guy who was skeptical of Jalen Green. There's a reason Ime Udoka almost benched the guy at the All-Star break. Now, credit to Ime for not doing that. He stayed the course, and he has been rewarded in a big way. Kudos to Ime. That could be really a franchise-altering decision, and it looks like he made the right one. But he very easily could have made a different one, and he made it clear that he was considering it. And so I know it's become easy for some on social media to, anytime something goes wrong, it's Rafael Stone's fault. And anytime something goes right, it's Ime Udoka's responsibility because he has the halo around him. So many things have gone right since Ime took the job. And, I get it because Ime has had a great year. But in this case, Ime Udoka was clearly questioning Jalen Green as well. So if your view is, how could the Rockets have considered moving Jalen for a non-star like Mikal Bridges, a good but not great player? well, if that's your view, it's not just Rafael Stone. It's Ime Udoka, and really it's beyond the Rockets. I mean, it's lots of guys around the league were skeptical on what Jalen could bring. And at the time, I think the thought was that the Rockets had a lot of high upside guys already. When you look at Şengün, you look at Amen Thompson, you look at Jabari Smith Jr., Tari Eason, Cam Whitmore. What if you got a little more certainty? I think there's a case you can make that perhaps you sacrifice a little bit of high-end upside for the higher floor if it looks like the high-end upside probably is not going to pan out. Now that it looks like the high-end upside very well could pan out for Jalen Green, the calculus changes. You incorporate that new information. So I think it's much ado about nothing. I think the Rockets will adjust to this new information. And if you're upset at them for not predicting this correctly, well, don't be just upset about Rafael Stone. Be upset about Ime Udoka. Be upset about everybody because, again, Rafael was far, far from alone in that view, if, in fact, that's the view that he had, which I certainly can't confirm. The last part of this equation that I want to get to, and that's the report itself. And I want to preface this by saying I am not trying to question Shams Charania. He is bigger and better than I will ever be. He is one of the two titans of NBA journalism at the moment, right alongside Woj when it comes to breaking news. However, I think a lot of people, at least on my timeline, have gone too far in making these guys infallible. And I think where this comes from, so guys like Shams and Woj and any of the top newsbreakers, they do bat nearly 1,000 when it comes to their reports on trade and free agency agreements. When they're getting news, for example, that the Rockets are going to sign Fred VanVleet, although that leaked through Woj, more on that in just a second. When those reports come out, they're typically from some combination of a front office member of one of the teams or an influential agent, many times both. And if it turns out that that source is misleading or lying to a guy like Shams or Woj, it becomes evident very, very quickly in that the signing or the trade doesn't happen. That's going to create an adversarial relationship between that team or that agency and one of the top two newsbreakers in the business, guys with tens of millions of followers across social media and their various website platforms. I should not have to explain why it's a terrible idea for an NBA team or agent to create an adversarial relationship with Woj or Shams. It shouldn't happen. It doesn't happen. And so because of that, when someone leaks to those guys that a deal is happening, that is usually 100% or very close to it. I mean, sometimes crazy things happen, but for the most part, those things do happen. And they bat a very high percentage. That's why they get the big bucks by their respective employers, Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN and Shams Charania of The Athletic. Of course, there's some guys beneath them as well, but they are the heads of their respective media agencies when it comes to the NBA. Now, when we're talking about trade talks and discussions, which is what we're talking about in this hypothetical of did the Rockets include Jalen Green in talks for Mikal Bridges? And of course, Shams brought it up on one of his streaming platforms as sort of just a by the by because Jalen Green has taken off in recent weeks with the Rockets. And now people around the league are wondering, well, did the Nets make a huge blunder in turning down Jalen Green, which it sort of looks like if that was the case that they did. And conversely, people in Houston are wondering, wow, were the Rockets saved from themselves by the Nets turning that down? It could be the case. However, as stated earlier, I know that's not coming from the Rockets. As I and others have reported, the Rockets' position is that names were never exchanged, that it was simply an exploratory feeler put out, the Nets shut it down, and that was that. Now, Brooklyn is clearly leaking something else because before the Shams report, I mean, there were just whispers from a couple of, I think the New York Post was one of them, but outlets from the New York area indicating that Jalen was a part of those talks. And here's where it gets messy. As compared to a trade or free agency agreement, where you're going to quickly have confirmation as to whether it's true or not, because either the deal is going to happen or it doesn't, with something like this, when we're talking about just discussions, it's impossible to prove that someone is lying to you. These phones are not wiretapped. And trust me that NBA executives are not going to put sensitive information in text that can be screenshotted. These are quick phone conversations, sometimes face-to-face. These are not situations where even Woj or Shams truly knows what's going on. It's one person's word against another. And sometimes, it may be 3 or 4 sets of words if an agency is in the mix, or maybe it's a 3-team trade situation, that sort of thing. And because the deal didn't happen, it's impossible to prove what an offer was or wasn't. It's not like the threat that comes from lying to Woj about a deal that's at the finish line. And then if it doesn't happen, then there's an obvious adversarial relationship because the most powerful guy in the NBA feels like you lied to him. In this case, no, we can't prove that the Nets are lying. So because of this, the accuracy when we're talking about discussions is much less than when we're talking about trade agreements. A lot of times people just sort of conflate everything together. These Woj bombs or whatever the fun hashtag is, I'm blanking on it now, Shams Wow or whatever it is. People sort of throw it all in the same bucket. But again, agreements and discussions are very different. I think it's clear, and it honestly was before this, that Brooklyn was leaking that Jalen Green was a part of those talks. Me personally, however, I just don't believe it. I've seen plenty of evidence that Brooklyn, in my opinion, is overinflating the value of their players. We've seen other reports like they had 5 first-round picks offered for Mikal Bridges, 2 for Dorian Finney-Smith, and none of these deals get to the finish line. Some of these, to me, they're difficult to believe. I think for various reasons, perhaps to inflate the value of those players around the league, perhaps to improve their relationship with those players by saying, look how much we value you. We turned down so-and-so. There could be any number of reasons. But the point is there's a long track record, at least this season, of Brooklyn leaking some things that, at least to me, appear somewhat outlandish. And so when I look at the Rockets side of the story and I look at the Brooklyn side of the story, I tend to believe the Rockets, especially when their version, which is that the Nets shut down discussions before they could even get into particulars, sort of meshes with what we've heard at a macro level most of the season about the Nets, which is that they have no interest in dealing Mikal Bridges, that they want to try to make some bigger swings this summer, and so on and so forth. So to tie this all together, this is not me trying to throw shade at Shams Charania, because as soon as I tried to make this point on social media, I had people saying, oh, so you think Shams Charania is fake news? You don't believe him? No, it's not that. It's that when you're talking about a story that is not a concrete agreement, but we're talking about just discussions, and it can't be proven wrong, the sources involved, in this case, the front office members, know they have a lot more liberties. They can be misleading. They can try and push an agenda because it's not like they're going to be clearly proven wrong. And in my opinion, just my opinion, that's what's happening here. Shams seems to believe Brooklyn for whatever reason. That's his opinion, and that's fine. But we shouldn't conflate these scoops he gets of actual transactions with his analysis of this. The hit rate, even for guys like Shams or Woj, when it comes to trade discussions, are a lot lower because it's just one person's word against another. They are not on the phone with these guys. They do not have screenshots of the text messages because, for the most part, there aren't any, at least not at a substantive level. The hit rate, even for guys like Shams or Woj, is a lot lower when we're talking about something like this. So that's what I really want to emphasize. Another angle, by the way, when it comes to Shams. So most NBA teams have a go-to when it comes to breaking news. And for the Rockets, I don't know how, when, or why this came to be, but the Rockets are an ESPN organization. And of course, that starts with Woj. And if you notice the Şengün MRI a couple of weeks ago, Woj was the guy who got that leak and broke that story. Fred VanVleet, that signing last summer, the flagship of Rockets 2023 free agency. Woj had that first. The Rockets are an ESPN organization. I've been told this time and time again. They are not from the Shams tree. Some other teams are. Again, I don't know exactly how or why that comes to be, but generally speaking, most teams around the league have a designated guy that they will run through. And of course, it's somewhat of a mutually beneficial relationship. And for the Rockets, that guy is Adrian Wojnarowski, and to a somewhat lesser extent, Tim McMahon, generally the ESPN tree, let's call it. In this case, I think it's pretty clear that the Rockets' perspective is not being weighted enough in what Shams is saying. And it's not just based on this. Let's go back a week before the deadline. Shams Charania and Sam Amick of The Athletic put out that big story that got Twitter all abuzz about the Rockets wanting to expedite the timeline and wanting to make a playoff push this year under Ime Udoka. And everyone wondered, why are they being so impatient, blah, blah, blah. The only move they made over that following week was to trade for Steven Adams, a guy who's not even going to play until next season. They did the complete opposite of that article. Now, that's not me saying that Shams is bad at his job. No, there's a lot of sources around the NBA, and there's a lot of narratives that are true. There are others that are false. And it's not that the Rockets will never take a phone call from The Athletic. Let's not make it out to be like that. It's not like there's a vendetta. But what I will say is that, generally speaking, Shams and The Athletic, at a high level, they are not as plugged in with the Rockets' thinking as certain others, and especially ESPN and Woj. So I think we're starting to see a trend where some of these angles in the Shams stories about the Rockets are fed from other sources. And maybe you believe those other sources. That's fine. But that's really what I want to hit home, is that this is not like a transaction where either it happens or it doesn't, and it's right or it's wrong. This is a lot more nebulous. In this case, I understand where Shams coming from, and he's clearly not on an island with this. Other people tied to the Nets have said the same thing. Should also note, by the way, that with the Nets being in New York City, Shams probably sees their front office members a lot more than he does Rafael Stone and his staff in Houston. That's just sort of the media landscape these days. Perhaps that plays a role as well in terms of who he believes. The bottom line, I think it's pretty clear that the Nets are pushing that story. However, I do not take it as gospel that it's true, because again, the Rockets have a very different story. And based on the track records of Brooklyn inflating their guys in many other scenarios, I'm inclined to believe that that's what's happening here as well. And that's not me saying anything negative about Shams Charania. He's a great reporter. It's just even great reporters have limitations within the current NBA media ecosystem, or whatever you want to call it. And I don't think the Rockets are fully being represented in some of these reports. Now, maybe you believe Shams. That's fine. All I'm saying is that there is a different side of this story. And this is not like when Shams reports a trade, and if you dispute that, well, you're just being silly. No, that's concrete information. This, because you can't clearly prove it wrong, a team like the Nets, or the Rockets for that matter, has a lot more. They have a lot more liberties to potentially, push the agenda a little bit, not be entirely truthful. In my opinion, could be wrong, but my opinion is that's what the Nets have done here. But with that said, even if the Rockets did include Jalen, which I have not heard myself, I think it's defensible. And I don't think it's that alarming, because even if that was the case, then whatever, there's new information now, and the Rockets can calibrate that into their thought processes this offseason. They obviously could not in February because it had not happened yet, and most people around the NBA have been stunned by how quickly this has turned around again. It's not just the Rockets. Everybody is stunned by this. So I know I've been a little bit long-winded there, but I wanted to cover it just as a journalist that's covered the league for a number of years. I wanted to share my perspective on this, because some of it is that I think it's largely irrelevant, but the other part, I don't even agree that it's necessarily true in the first place simply because Shams said it. I feel like a lot of my timeline, at least, just took it as gospel. The second it came out of Shams's mouth on that streaming show, just took it as, well, that's got to be true because it's Shams. And on a subject like this, that's not necessarily the case. So that's my thoughts on that. Hopefully we can close the book on it, because with Jalen playing like this, I do not think the Rockets will look, or at least I don't think they should, at moving Jalen for Mikal this offseason. Paulo, did you want to get anything in on that front? Because I know you had some thoughts on your timeline as well.
Yeah, I think you said a lot of what I wanted to say. I'll add that you can't get too stuck in the verbiage used in these reports. And I think, as we know, in 2024 media, words get twisted to tell different narratives. The same story can be told two different ways. And if the Rockets approach the Nets and say, hey, we'd like to discuss a trade around Mikal Bridges, Jalen isn't untouchable, and we have, some picks that are obviously yours, let's discuss something. The Nets can take that and say, hey, we discussed a trade with the Houston Rockets around, the Rockets wanted to discuss a trade around Mikal Bridges that involved Jalen Green and multiple first-round picks. And they're not lying, but that's not what happened. You see the way I twisted it just really easily, and I'm not even native. It's not that hard. And so, do I have doubts that they did discuss perhaps a trade that involved Jalen? Yes. Or do I have done? Probably not. But if you think back at the time, I think 80% of Rockets Twitter would have done a trade that were Jalen Green for Mikal Bridges straight up, or Jalen and a pick for Mikal Bridges, for example, because Jalen's stock was really, really down. And then besides that, I don't think we can be results-based for some things and process-based for others. I'm sorry. So why is everybody saying, oh, Rafael Stone almost traded Jalen Green, as opposed to, oh, Rafael Stone was one of the last people that ultimately believed in Jalen Green because he didn't trade him when the most common, the most common outcome was, or the most common opinion on Twitter was for people to want him to be traded.
Well, and beyond that, if you're saying Rafael Stone almost traded Jalen Green, why aren't you saying that Ime Udoka almost benched Jalen Green?
That only goes to show how agenda-driven it is. And I mean, I'm saying this really seriously. If 3 years from now Jalen Green is a superstar, you can paint the picture both ways. You can say, oh my God, they almost traded Jalen Green, or you can say, oh my God, they believed in Jalen Green until the last season of his career when he didn't show enough to warrant that. I think both are valid narratives or ways to put it, but at the end of the day, what counts for Rafael's career is what was ultimately done. And what was ultimately done is he held on to Jalen Green. So whatever the process was, that's what happened. That's what you need him to be judged on, not what could have potentially happened. So I think there's two. We have a saying in Portuguese that I can't really translate because it doesn't really make sense. So we have, two ways, as in from weight, that we're using to discuss different moves in, different ways. So before, during the first 3 years of the rebuild, a lot of people said, oh, a lot of these decisions make sense or made sense at the time. But what happens is what the result was. And then now it's, oh, we didn't trade Jalen, but what matters is that we almost did. And this is assuming that the almost did is factual when we don't even know if that's the case.
We don't even know that's it. Yeah.
So it's just more of the same thing.
Yeah.
Of people want to pin the good things on Stone and the bad, the good things on Udoka and the bad things on Stone. And at the end of the day, I'd also like to mention that you're not going to get Daryl Morey again. Daryl Morey is not the same guy he was when he came into the Rockets. Across the league, the quality of GMing has raised. There's less and less past players or old legends leading front offices and judging it by the eye test that you can take advantage of. Because that's what Daryl Morey did. He took advantage of guys that were there because they were big names in whatever franchises they were, and he took advantage of their incompetence. In a more competent league, it's harder to have the massive swings. And the fact that Stone has done as well as he's done, I think it's commendable. And I think you can't say that, as we've said this before, you can't say you like all of the core six, especially now that Jalen Green's playing well. You can't say that you like all of the core six. You can't say that Dylan, Landale, and Fred VanVleet were good veteran acquisitions that managed to let the rest of the team shine without taking the full stage away from them. And at the same time, say Rafael Stone did a bad job because you thought the picks were obvious, or you thought that he shouldn't have traded Jared Allen, which I agree with, but hindsight's 2020. You can't have the expectation that a front office is going to be perfect because it's not a game where you're playing not against NPCs. You're playing against real people. Other people have to win sometimes too. You're not going to win every single move. You're not going to be perfect. And when you look back at great GMs of the past, if they're considered great now, it's because their successes outweigh their failures, and when that happens, people forget their failures.
Bottom line for me, Ime Udoka deserves credit for staying the course with Jalen, even when there were clear reasons to consider a change, and he definitely considered those. And by that same token, Rafael Stone deserves credit for sticking with Jalen Green, even though many people around certainly the fan base, but around the NBA wondered if the Rockets would move on because after 2.5 years, there had not been a lot of progress. Now we are seeing that progress, and I think that will be reflected in the Rockets' analysis this offseason. Now, if it's not, if you start hearing reports that even after this stretch, the Rockets aren't fully bought in on Jalen, and that's coming from credible reporters with ties to the Rockets, then okay. At that point, there's conversations to be had. But I just don't see the point in wasting much mental energy on this hypothetical from months ago that obviously never came close to fruition. Way too much is made of this story. It's way too speculative. It's way too old. It just does not matter. Be thankful for the product you have. And as far as how things fit long term, the Rockets will figure that out this offseason with information from the past month that they obviously did not have in January when these conversations may or may not have taken place, depending on who you believe. Anyway, we've gone on long enough for one episode, but boy, when you try to combine both the micro team winning 9 straight games, 11-1 in March, with a little bit of macro as far as the Mikal Bridges trade, Jalen Green, and what that means for Rafael Stone, feels like there's a new Rafael talking point every week. I don't know how some of these people do it. Whatever, it all leads to a long episode, and that's what we naturally do here at the Logger Line more often than not, so I guess this is fitting. Anyway, for today, we'll bring it to a close, and if you want more content before our next episode, best place to get it is on Twitter/X. Paulo's on there at Paulo Alves NBA, and I'm on there at Ben DuBose. And this show, The Logger Line, if you go to that handle or twitter.com/The Logger Line, you hit up the link tree in the bio, you can find obviously our friends, partners, and sponsors, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Karbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, official flagship of the team. You can access all of their content, and of course, you support our friends, partners, and sponsors, you're supporting us as well. But you can also find links to our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify. Subscribe to this show, leave it a 5-star review if you have not already, and that can help us. You get the benefit of episodes as soon as they're released before I can even post them to one of those blogs, and we get the benefit with hopefully your happy review and subscription of looking good to our friends, partners, and sponsors and keeping this program running as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with those plugs complete, we will adjourn. Again, for Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always to all of you for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line. Go Rockets.